Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Rachelle, I'm the Development Director at Trinity Hall. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the next in our climate change event series. We have 7 decades of alumni who've registered to watch from 1953 to a matriculation year of 2019. So welcome to you all. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to all of you that have made donations alongside our online events. We're incredibly grateful and they make a huge difference to our students. So thank you so much. Now, tonight we are delighted to welcome a panel of 4 alumni and an international panel at that for a discussion. And I know we have many alumni working in this space, but we're delighted to welcome James, Catriona, David and Andy. And this discussion is going to be chaired by Jennifer Howard-Grenville, who's chaired several of our Trinity Hall Entrepreneur Network events. And Professor Jennifer Howard-Grenville is the Diageo Professor of Organisation Studies at the Cambridge Judge Business School and also a fellow commoner at Trinity Hall. She's an expert in qualitative research and organisational change and explores how people and organisations generate and navigate change related to sustainability. So I'm going to hand over to Jen to introduce our panel. So I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you so much, Shell. And it's wonderful to be here with these very inspiring individuals. We know that entrepreneurs are by their nature problem solvers and disruptors. So we're going to kick off tonight's event by hearing from each of them about how their entrepreneurial activities are tackling the problem of climate change. So we've just got a few minutes for each of them to give you an overview, and then we'll dive into some more specific questions. James, I'd love to start with you and learn about your entrepreneurial activities.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm the co-founder at Geeky. We're a social enterprise based in the UK, and we help individuals understand, track, and reduce their carbon footprints. And then we also help companies engage their staff on sustainability and see how they can take action together. You all have heard that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, but sometimes the missing piece is, what does that actually mean for individuals? So in the UK, the average carbon footprint is around 9 tons. In the US, the average carbon footprint is around 16 tons. By 2030, because globally we have to cut emissions and developed countries have higher ones, we all need to get to 2.5 tons. That's not much more than the average diet, including food waste in most nations at the moment. So there's a huge amount that we need to do, but there are loads of things we can do to get there. And so that's what we help people do, map out their personal pathways to net zero. And having launched just last year, we're now lucky to work with everything from small villages and community groups up to global companies like NatWest and Deloitte. Thank you.
That's fantastic, James. And you're absolutely right. In order to reduce the carbon emissions that we need to reduce, it's not just companies, it's individuals, and putting the tools in individuals' hands is absolutely crucial. I've calculated my own carbon footprint, and despite not driving a vehicle and cycling around Cambridge and never eating meat, it's not where it needs to be. So thanks for that work that you're doing. Catriona, you're next.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name is Catriona McGill. I'm head of operations and part of the executive team at a company called Desolinator. We are an Anglo-Dutch startup. I'm based out of the Maastricht office, which is right in the south of the Netherlands. And we are looking at solar-powered desalination. So, in case you've never heard of it before, desalination is turning seawater into drinking water. And in some places in the world, this is a really fundamental technology that enables people to live in the places where they want to live, where there is no source of clean drinking water. So, yeah, as it stands, really amazing technology in its own right. There are 2 big problems with it. The first is the energy footprint, the carbon footprint associated with it. So it's incredibly energy intensive. So it takes a lot of fossil fuels to turn that seawater into drinking water. And the second problem you have is the waste brine. You've got feed water coming in and then 2 streams coming out, which is product water and brine. And that brine is often full of really nasty toxic chemicals. So we are developing a technology that tackles both. So we're doing a solar powered, so it's 100% solar powered. So the energy side is carbon neutral, and our brine is, we don't need any chemicals. Or very little chemicals. So our brine is much cleaner than the alternative. So that's what we're doing. And I've just been there for 5 years in 1 month, celebrating my 5-year anniversary. So there you go, that's what I do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catriona. And actually, you know, with COP26 kicking off now, it's all climate, but this is a fantastic reminder that there are multiple environmental impacts that technologies have. And in addressing some of the challenges that our world faces, you know, they come up in different ways. So it's wonderful to see your venture tackling two for one, as we could say. David, you're next.
Thank you very much, Jen, and wonderful to be joining such an august panel today to discuss entrepreneurship and climate change. So I'm one of the 2 co-founders of Vedantix, and we're a business research firm that focuses on world-enhancing strategies with quite a strong technology bias. And I founded the firm 12 years ago. Originally, I was trying to persuade somebody I knew from Trinity, who was a utility sector equity analyst, to join up, and this was over a dinner. And then ultimately, another friend who was at the dinner, who was at Jesus and studying astrophysics, decided this was more something he wanted to do. So interesting to go back to, you know, some of the thinking about, you know, entrepreneurs and where does the journey start. And you know, on reflection, we've been running the firm for 12 years now, and of course there's been a huge change in the last couple of years, in part because of the pandemic and in part because of all of the tragic fires and floods around the world, where the market opportunity has changed. And I think in your introduction you were talking about, well, entrepreneurs are disruptive, and we actually thought about it in a slightly different way, which is, I think any entrepreneurial business is innovative. You have to be innovative. It has to start with some kind of an idea. But if you look at large companies, they are mostly trading on momentum. So our idea was to actually say, we're going to provide business-friendly research about climate change, about sustainability more broadly, and really align that with the way large businesses think, which is, you know, what are the things that we can incorporate into our existing processes so that we're, you know, performing at least as well as the companies that we compare ourselves with. So that was really where we started from. So actually, you know, not so disruptive, much more kind of an educational, if you like, approach. And so if you took something like net zero emission strategies, which I'm sure many people on the webinar would know about, what we would do is produce research to help a company, a Chevron, a Diageo, you know, an Amazon. How do you actually implement your net zero emission strategy? What are other organizations similar to yours doing to, for instance, electrify their fleet, decarbonize their buildings and so on? And so that's really my entrepreneurial story. So not so much on the disruptive side, but definitely on the innovation side.
Thank you, David. And you're absolutely right. I mean, but disruption can come from many sides. And I think the opportunity to help businesses respond with good information and credibly is absolutely what we need to sort of change everything that we need to change to address climate change. Andy, last but not least, please tell us a little bit about your venture.
All right. Good evening. My name's Andy Williams. I'm the CFO here at Ampersand in Kigali, Rwanda. And thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I feel very honored to be included. So transportation, it's one of the largest contributors of greenhouse gases. About 20% of global emissions come from road transport. And so as part of tackling climate change, we need to decarbonize transport and at the mass market level. So at Ampersand, our approach is aimed at the moto taxi market here in East Africa. Moto taxis are the 125cc motorbikes that zip around all over the place. They're actually the backbone of the transport system here. There are about 5 million motor taxis in East Africa, and in Rwanda, they represent roughly about 60% of the traffic on the roads. There are actually about 25,000 motos in Kigali alone. So Ampersand, what we're trying to do is convert these 5 million bikes to electric motorcycles. And for each bike we put on the road, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a net 5 tons per bike per year. So quite a big impact. So how does it work? So imagine pulling into a petrol station, and instead of filling up your bike with petrol, you just do a battery swap. It takes less than 2 minutes, and you pay for the energy you've used in the battery you've just dropped off. And by the way, the energy that you're paying for is 25% cheaper than what you would be paying for per kilometer with petrol. So the experience is just like a fuel stop. At Ampersand, we own the batteries, which and we look after them and charge them up. And by doing this, we take away the main barrier to electrification of motorcycles here, and that is the cost. The batteries actually cost way more than the bikes themselves. And also there's a concern over battery reliability, especially as it's a new technology. So we handle that. So overall, with our bikes, the motors take home 50% more than they would using petrol bikes. And for people who are earning less than $2 a day, that's what households live on here in Rwanda, it's a big deal. And we've actually got a waiting list of about 7,000 motors here in Kigali. And we've just started. We've got about 50 bikes on the road right now who've been operating commercially for 2 years. So we've proved the concept. The next step is scaling. And in fact, we just announced today a debt facility of $9 million, which we've just in the process of closing, which will allow us to put 1,000 bikes on the road next year, which is actually a couple of 1,000 bikes on the road next year. So bottom line, value proposition is there and proven. We just need a relatively small investment to really scale. We reckon about $200 million to replace all 100,000 bikes in Rwanda, and maybe over the next 5 years, and maybe about $3 billion to replace all 5 million bikes in East Africa. And it might sound like a lot, but that's actually a pretty modest price tag to, convert, 50% of the traffic on the road to electric.
Yeah, super, Andy. Thank you. It's so inspiring listening to all of you. I mean, obviously, you're representing different spaces of this complex problem, different geographies, different, working from large corporations to moto taxis. So it's really exciting to see the variety. One thing in common with entrepreneurship is, or as we typically think of it, is sort of, rapid thinking, lots of experimentation. The classic sort of fail frequently, fail often, and learn from it, bringing solutions to the fore and checking if they're working in the market. Also, a lot of personal qualities, incredible resilience and a personal willingness to put a lot on the line and potentially to fail and learn. So when we think about climate change, or how entrepreneurs can tackle climate change alongside all of the other things that they're needing to do, what are any specific skills or attributes that entrepreneurs need to bring to the challenge of climate change? I'll just let whichever of you wants to jump into that first come off mute, and then maybe you can build on each other's answers. Yeah, go ahead, James.
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, so I actually worked in finance for 20 years before I started Geeky with my wife. And it really highlighted the difference in qualities that you need. I worked for a financial firm that considered itself to be entrepreneurial, and in a way in its sector it was, but compared to a startup, it absolutely was not. But I think that the two that really stand out that are different at the moment, one is that when you're working in climate at the moment, one of the qualities you have to have is the ability to be both deeply, deeply pessimistic about what's happening, and yet at the same time, fundamentally optimistic about the fact we're going to sort it out. because you can't just give people the idea it's all going to be fine. It's not. But at the same time, if you tell them it's all doom and gloom, they're not going to do anything either. I think that balance is often difficult to strike, but really important. And the other one that isn't particularly, perhaps just for the climate side, but it's just that idea that when you're an entrepreneur, just having an absolute certainty about what your mission is, because there is no end of people that will queue up to tell you where your initial idea won't work, or your initial MVP or beta product won't work, or what's wrong with your current product and why it's going to fail. And some of that will be valid criticism to listen to, but you've just got to go, I get that, I'm listening, but I'm still plowing on because I know what the mission is.
Fantastic, thanks. Catriona.
Yeah, very similar. My observation is that you've just got to have someone on your founding team who is just a pure visionary, and they can see what it's knowing the mission, and the whole team has to know the mission, but they also can see 20 years in the future what it could look like if you succeed, and they have to be able to convince the team that, and your investors that, and just there's definitely the single-mindedness of the goal, and also the vision of like where we're going, that I see is you've got to have that in your team, and also just a healthy mix in general across your founding team.
Yeah, if I could build on that. So I'm an entrepreneur myself, and then also work with a lot of technology entrepreneurs, literally from the founder up to bigger organizations. And I guess I'd split it into two categories. So you have this personality trait, which is about determination, resilience, as Catriona was saying, almost faith. There has to be, within the entrepreneur who has the idea, you have to have faith. And going back to starting Vedantics, maybe not the smartest thing to do, but started it in 2007. And myself and my business partner couldn't pay ourselves for 21 months. So, in terms of real proof points, that's not something that, people would do unless you're absolutely sure that ultimately you can get there. But on the other side, and I think Catriona was pointing to this, is a really interesting angle in terms of the business skills of entrepreneurs. And I think that's where you get a much broader divergence, because you may have one, two, you may have three founders. And actually, you don't want three visionary founders. That tends not to work very well. So the visionaries who I work with, that can be a little bit, too much. You need somebody on the team to tame them a little bit and make that vision practical. So I think the personality traits are very consistent. But the business skills, you really have to think about the balance required. Just like a rugby team, not everyone's playing the fly half, and if everyone thinks they are, they're never going to win. And I think that's probably the interesting area for anyone to think through to try and help entrepreneurial ventures succeed.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. You lost me slightly on the rugby, but we'll talk afterwards. Andy, anything to add? What are the attributes entrepreneurs should bring specifically to climate change?
I think it's common with any sort of startup I've worked in, and I reinforce what's already been said. I think you need an attribute. You need a visionary. As Catriona said, and their main job is, building the team and selling the story to investors, governments, other interested parties. Here in the third world, our biggest challenge is actually building the team, because the existing sort of, people that we need here, on the technology side don't exist. So actually trying to get people to come over here and, I thought it would be easy, sell them an African adventure and saving the planet, but it's actually proved to be quite difficult.
Yeah, well, I'm sure the pandemic hasn't made it a whole lot easier, but thank you, Andy. So all of these are great ways that we can sort of resonate with the entrepreneurial challenge and opportunity. I think coming back to James's point as well, that with climate change, there's huge cause for pessimism, but we have to stay optimistic. And as Catriona said, if you can paint a picture 20 years in the future, frankly, climate change is doing that for us. We have a strong sense. We don't know exactly what will unfold, but we have actually pretty good evidence, and I think many people are being convinced. So this relates to the next question, really, about how one can sort of balance the urgency of attending to climate change with the fact that entrepreneurial ventures, and you've all been at it for different periods of time, which is fascinating. Even if it's not technical, even if it doesn't rely on new patented technology that needs to be proven in the market and connect to other complementors, any venture takes a long time to build and to really get sort of, build traction. So how do we challenge, how do we meet that challenge against the fact that climate change isn't waiting and we need the solutions as soon as possible? So I think both James and David, you had something to say about this. Shall we start with David and then go to James?
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, indeed, quite long in the tooth in terms of seeing how this market has evolved, and you could say how little urgency there has been until recently in terms of governments and investors and the majority of the business world really seeing that it made sense to deliver on pledges. And so I think there are two aspects to this that any entrepreneur, in looking at climate change market opportunities, because effectively that is, it has to be a market opportunity for it to be a valuable business. My first piece of advice is really think about the product market fit and is the timing right? So it is the market that you're going into genuinely ready to invest in your desalination plant, your electric motor taxis, because fundamentally what we see a lot of is you have somebody who has an idea, it's a great idea, it solves a problem, but do the people, the stakeholders within that context want the problem to be solved? So to give you an example, we know some firms who have provided carbon accounting software for 12, 13 years, and they raised venture capital money, they had a sensible team, and then effectively they never scaled their business above 50 people because companies were thinking, well, why do I need to spend on this now? I'm not required to do it for compliance purposes. Virtually none of my competitors are doing it. I don't need that level of granular data to deliver on my carbon reduction targets. So actually, those businesses just went sideways for a decade. And it wasn't just one, it was every business that was doing the same thing. Fast forward to now, so a company I'm in touch with who are based out of Arizona, they've been around for 2 years. Last week, they raised $101 million. And so their technology is, okay, it's an updated version of what was available in 2009, but fundamentally, they're trying to solve the same problem with slightly better software. It's just now the market is ready. So it's a challenging one because often as an entrepreneur, you feel I must get my product done, it must be differentiated, and I need to get it into the market so that the customers who are just sitting there waiting for the right solution are going to want to buy from me. But in reality, what we see is there's just so much need to diagnose whether or not those people want that problem to be solved. And that's where, if you think about the entrepreneurial team, it's great to have a vision, but other people need to share that vision. And so you need to go and test that in the market. So I think that for anyone who's thinking about how do we tackle climate change and really make it work, that is the key question to answer.
Yeah, really well said, David. You can be passionate about a solution, but unless there's a sort of a market and there's a demand and there's a pull and the time is right for that solution and people are willing to pay for it because it addresses a pain point, it's never going to get off the ground. James.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates. I mean, if I think just back 18 months ago, we were going to companies with almost exactly the same pitch we go to them with today and getting very little response. Fast forward, and those companies are now coming back to ask us. So I think that really shows that how fast things are moving, but also exactly that you've got to be in the right product for the right time. For us, the time to market bit is kind of interesting because we're trying to deal with sort of long-term behavior change. So we're in a position where a lot of the things that we are encouraging people to do are either nearly developed or actually on the market, like some of the great solutions that people talked about today. And with each one of those, the messaging's got to be a bit different. So for an individual, there are like easy wins in terms of what they can do. So if you turn off your lights, you're going to save money and save carbon. If you switch to a green pension, your financial returns aren't any better, but your carbon footprint's a lot lower. But then it kind of gets harder. Then you kind of get the slightly countercultural stuff, like moving to a more plant-based diet, or buying less things, or buying more secondhand, things that we've sort of moved away from over the last 20 years. And then you've got the really tough ones, which are the sort of ones where you're doing something for the greater good. So you give up flying, even if no one else does. You buy a heat pump, even though it's very expensive compared to a gas boiler, because you want to reduce your footprint. And those, in terms of the time to market, as you go kind of through the easy to the mediums to the for the greater good, that bit's really hard to scale. The first one's relatively straightforward, and yeah, America in particular, the blitz scale. Here's big chunks of money, hire a big team. That's what startups are great at. Cracking the long-term behavior change, I think that's going to be still pretty difficult.
Thank you, James. I think that's huge, because I think we sort of associate entrepreneurship in our heads with, the new approach, the new business model, the brilliant idea, whether it's car sharing or the new technology, the iPhone, and it's so compelling that everyone wants one, and it makes their lives easier or more convenient, or it gives them another option. And the reality is, to tackle climate change, our behaviors, particularly in the North and the West, must change, and they must change radically, and that's uncomfortable. That's hard to sell people in many ways, and so I think that's a real reality check. The next question, I think Andy, you were happy to speak to, and anyone obviously on the panel, but it raises the question. Many of the things that you said are crucial for your entrepreneurial teams. Having the vision and having the right balance and the right mix and having the business savvy, all really important. Are there any, apart from what James has already pointed out, challenges and patience to address these longer term behavioral things? Are there any further attributes or skills? Do we need a different kind of entrepreneur to really tackle some of the hard things around climate change, which I might remind us are all going to be hard? Andy, do we need a new kind of entrepreneur, and what new skills do we need to add to that mix that we've already talked about?
I think with climate change, I think, a lot of the technology is already there. So the issue isn't about, I mean, in the motor taxi world, it isn't about, a battery the size of a, little can of, chewing gum that will power a bike for 1,000 miles. It isn't about that. The technology is already there. I don't know if you've heard about the Hershey's Kiss approach to technology development, but if you don't know what Hershey Kisses, imagine a pyramid, or visualize a pyramid, and that suggests that there's a trickle down of technology from new expensive technology developed and tested and paid for by rich consumers that sort of eventually trickles down to the mass market. And, at Ampersand, we suggest, flipping that over, turning it upside down. I mean, our technology is not rocket science. It isn't brand new. We're taking existing technology and applying it to a mass market outside of the first world, and in fact, at Ampersand, we're hoping to show that, we can lead the charge on climate change action, in the third world. We don't have to wait for the first world to, lead the way with new technology. I think there's a couple of other things I'd like to add to that as well. you know, look, there's emerging, and I think David and James both alluded to this. There's new investors and new sources of funding that's coming into the scene. There's impact investors. You know, everybody's talking about impact investments in the VC world, where they're not looking at a pure financial return. They have a longer term vision and looking at their impact. A lot of development agencies are also, you know, kind of providing grants. In fact, we survived COVID largely through a couple of grants from USAID and UK DFID. And also looking at the big companies that we've actually received grant from Shell Foundation and have Total Energies as an investor. Both big petrochemical companies, but they see the writing on the wall and they have big pockets. Let's use them. Also, I think entrepreneurs should be working with governments. Here in Rwanda, we've worked along with a couple of other companies here to persuade the government to give electric vehicles 0% duties. So, you know, kind of encouraging and making it cheaper for us to make things happen. And in fact, Rwanda last year announced that all motor taxis are going to go electric. No time frame or how they're going to do it, but they definitely want to do it. And the final thing I'd say is be pragmatic. You can't solve everything. We originally started wanting to make all our charging stations solar. So we were completely sort of green. And at the end of the day, we realized the grid is actually pretty clean here in East Africa. It's largely hydro, geothermal, or solar. So what problem are we trying to solve there? Let's solve the problem we're good at. Let's be the distributor of energy and not worry about how it's produced right now. Let somebody else solve that problem.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Andy. I mean, you're speaking to a lot of things that I think are really becoming much more important when we look at climate change or just tackling some of the other societal challenges we have. So we tend to think, I guess, traditionally of the, you know, the sort of the lone entrepreneurs emerging out of their garage and having a solution that scales rapidly. They don't necessarily work in partnership. They're not necessarily thinking about the local conditions. It's all about scale and it's all about them. And the funding models, as you said, have been more traditional. So I think when we're looking at climate change, it's exciting to realize that there are alternatives, and particularly the notion of partnerships. I mean, we didn't get into this mess alone. No single individual, government, or company is responsible. We're all collectively responsible. So do we need to think differently about partnerships? Catriona, maybe you can give us some examples of how you've been using partnerships to advance your business.
Yeah, so we've been really fortunate and had some amazing partnerships. We, in various different forms, we've done a handful of accelerator programs. So these, for people who maybe have not heard of that, that's where a company or an institution brings on board a load of startups and helps them to accelerate their business in whatever form that might take. So some might be training and mentoring, and they help with your business plan and your pitch. We did one we did a very successful one with booking.com because we have a really interesting proposition for island hotels. So a lot of seawater, a lot of sunshine, not a lot of clean drinking water. So to understand what our target market would look like, we are really well supported by Carlsberg, interestingly, who are interested in our technology for kind of a water resilience in the future as water changes and increasingly monsoons or the local water aquifers, seawater level rises, they get salty. And they are probably the most amazing partner. They have a really great attitude towards understanding that we are a startup and that how our technology compares to the existing technologies in the market. And we also did a program with in Dubai with the Dubai Future Foundation, where they also brought startups from around the world to Dubai to see how they could partner with different Dubai government entities, because there various different reasons, and there wasn't, this was quite a few years ago at the time, much of a startup scene in Dubai. So they decided that they were going to bring it in from abroad, which I think is, yeah, cool, really not that good idea for them. And so we ended up being partnered with the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, and who said this is one of my favorite work experiences ever. They said ours was one of the least stupid ideas they've ever been presented with, which I was very flattered by. And they were our partners for our first pilot project. So, you know, without partnerships, yeah, we wouldn't be where we are today. So
that's fantastic. It sounds like you've done a lot in terms of learning the potential, you know, as David was talking about earlier, you need to know who that is a solution for. And so these opportunities have exposed you to that, and booking.com, who'd have thought, right? But it makes sense. And I think also being called least stupid, what an honor, because you probably weren't sufficiently visionary if you didn't have that. At least you weren't the most. So that's fantastic, Catriona. Thank you for being honest. David, would you like to speak to the question of partnerships?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I think what it boils down to for me is really the question around system change. Because if you're a firm that has a brilliant technology solution, it's still extremely hard to get any sort of system change, because you're really trapped within the way, you know, the existing system works, and there's so much momentum behind it, as James was saying. You know, if I want to have a ground source heat pump, if it's going to cost me 10 times more than replacing my boiler, which funnily enough, James, is currently broken. You know, so we're currently, you know, considering this question at home. So I think a great example is something like moving from linear supply chains and this whole idea of, you know, buying new products to the circular economy. And, you know, that is something fundamentally where you can't have a single company that says, well, we're going to do this for everyone, because you need you know, a whole ecosystem to shift their way of working. And even within that, though, I still see a role for entrepreneurs. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where she'd sailed through, I think, the Pacific garbage patch, and she was so incensed by that when she got back to port on the Isle of Wight. She pretty much soon after sailing around the world single-handedly started the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and that was maybe 15 years ago. I think they now have 500 employees and lots of engagement. And that's worked really well with a lot of EU policies on the circular economy and, you know, minimum levels of recycling vehicle parts and that type of thing. And you just need, I think, to shift people's values so that a new ecosystem can be built that still satisfies the same stakeholders. A great example, I think, of an NGO really being the center of all of those partnerships and new way of thinking.
Yeah, thank you, David. And actually, funnily enough, I was teaching this afternoon on circular economy to the undergraduate engineering course I teach here on sustainable business. So this new kind of thinking is absolutely needed, and that sort of joined up thinking, not just with partners, but addressing these issues, because once we start reusing material rather than the linear model, we also save energy, which tackles climate change. It's not a win-win-win across the board. We need to be really clever about it. James, I just wanted to give you an opportunity. You don't need to take it, but if you had anything to add on this question of partnerships and how we tackle the problems, you know, collectively, that would be great.
No, nothing to add. Just I also really like that booking.com example, because like whose business plan would have included that one? No one's, but who had an idea that had a really good product, and it's a really good example of what it's like being an entrepreneur. Yeah,
I think you know, we talk about serendipity a certain amount in any kind of entrepreneurship, but I think that's a wonderful example. So we're getting sort of deeper into how climate change is not just something that we need to tackle in new ways with new types of partnerships, approaches, funding, but also, you know, climate change is joined to many of these other issues, including material consumption and increasingly some of the work that I've been looking into around nature. And of course, we know there are nature-based solutions, but we also know that we're degrading nature and biodiversity at an alarming rate. And these two issues will continue to exacerbate each other over time. So in what ways might entrepreneurs' approaches sort of innovate and contribute to solving some of the problems jointly that we face? Again, maybe Catriona, I can ask you to start, but others please join in.
Yeah, well, this is what a nice question for my company, because yeah, so we I mean, at its simplest, our technology is replicating the natural water cycle. So we do thermal desalination, which is where you boil the seawater to create steam. You collect the steam and then condense that steam, and that steam is pure distilled water that you then remineralize. So we didn't invent this technology. This has been around for a while, but at its essence, it reflects the water cycle. So I like it. But with regards to both reducing the carbon impact and looking out for biodiversity, that's really the dual focus of our company. We've got solar powered impact to reduce the carbon footprint and reducing the impact that the waste brine has on the environment. Because yeah, we might not like it, but we are reliant on desalination in a lot of places around the world. So to make it, and in some places it does have a really nasty effect on marine life. So if you can reduce that impact at all, you're helping. And I think if I would take a stand back and look at it, I think this is where entrepreneurs can be of service, of value. If I look at the desalination industry, it has been very widely found, very widespread since the 70s, really, when industrial desalination came. And if you look about what's happened then for the last 50 years, they've made really good efficiency gains, and they've really brought the price down. But that's the only innovation that's happened in 50 years. And so in some cases it can be, you know, the outsiders and the entrepreneurs who bring the step change next level for the industry.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I will just remind people who are watching, if you have a question for an individual panelist or the group, please just pop it into the Q&A. We will have a few minutes for Q&A, but we have lots of questions. And as you can tell, we're having a great conversation here, and I'm learning so much from our panelists' expertise. So we'll just keep on going. One of the things that we haven't spoken about yet, because we've been sort of oriented towards how your ventures and other entrepreneurial ideas might sort of tackle questions around climate change and sustainability more broadly, is really how important it is for an entrepreneurial venture to have their own sustainability strategy. So clearly we know this from big companies, you know, they can't send the message out there that their clients or employees or customers need to act sustainably if they aren't doing so themselves. So where do you see that landing with your ventures? You know, how important it is to have your own, to walk the talk, I suppose, and how do you develop a sustainability strategy, or do you? I think James, you wanted to say something about that, but then again, obviously everyone else can chime in.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial now, and for two reasons. The first one is there is increasingly zero tolerance for people who talk but don't act. And that's where companies can really get themselves in difficulty, whether it's called greenwashing or anything else, the gap between intent and action. So things like having and not just a net zero strategy, but a very well articulated one about how you're going to cut first, and then use nature-based solutions if you need to for anything else. But then starting to push beyond that, because they're great in a way that, you know, more than 5,000 companies have signed up to the Race to Zero, pushing beyond that with how you interact on a day-to-day. So just as some little tiny examples in our case, We have various policies to help staff. So for example, if they want to go on a climate strike, that's paid holiday. If they want to go on holiday and they take the train rather than the plane, it takes them longer, that's extra paid holiday. So there's lots of teeny things in our case, but much bigger things for large organizations that they can do to say, look, this is how we're going beyond just sort of net zero. And then all of that be incredibly transparent, because that's an increasing demand. And then the second reason is that actually startups have an outsized influence for their kind of small revenue, their small employee size. And that's because large companies are increasingly looking to them for ideas, whether that's formally through incubators or whether informally through trade mags, trade events, those sorts of things. And people kind of want to be pushed on these questions now. So yeah, I think for those two reasons, it's having one that is really deeply ingrained in what you do, I think has become really crucial.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I thought you could speak from your perspective about, what are expectations and levels of transparency? How do you see firms changing?
I absolutely agree with James. I mean, 12, 13 years ago, there are actually very few firms who would have anybody called sustainability. So that job title really appeared 15 years ago, and clearly you would now expect it in, I think, any firm that has 500 employees. I mean, I think really small firms, people understand it's a bit hard to, day one when you start a company to say, well, we're going to allocate a lot of cash and time to having a fully formed kind of sustainability strategy and communications plan. So I don't think that's essential. But if you're in the market as we are, so we actually have some of our larger clients who put us through a sustainability procurement evaluation. So if we, to James's point, if we failed that, then they would turn around and say, well, you actually didn't pass the evaluation, and so I'm afraid either come back to us in 3 months' time once you've improved what you're doing, or else we're just not going to work with you anymore. So we absolutely see that happening, and we're only a 50 employee organization, so you don't have to be big for that to start impacting you.
Yeah, you speak to that issue with supply chain. So Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, my initial reaction to this was, for a small company, small startup, your leverage is negligible at first. But what has been interesting is that our funders have demanded this of us. Our investors and grantees and even our debt funders have made this important. And I see historically that HR issues and human rights issues have been sort of like very prevalent and in the press. You can't run sweatshops and have child labor sources. Now I think that's that sort of mentality and approach is going to is increasingly looking at sustainability in the same way.
Excellent. Catriona, did you want to add on the question of sort of sustainability strategy as an entrepreneurial venture? If you don't have anything to add, don't feel that you need to, but I just wanted to give you a chance.
Just that Dave is right, in a small early stage company, it's quite hard. But I think if it's part of your company's DNA, then it will come. As I think back to when we started, someone said a policy compliance. What is that? And now a couple of years later, it makes more sense, and it's something that will come. But I think it's really important, and it also will, with employing the new hires and people coming out of university. If you haven't got something like that, I think a lot of people won't be interested.
Great. No, it's you've summed it up. The pressure is coming from all sides, and we're all holding each other to a higher standard. And I think entrepreneurial ventures can set, James's examples were fantastic examples of things that should make large corporations feel bad and do things differently. Maybe not feel bad, but just innovate. There's a question in the Q&A from Rupert, and so I think it's a great question. He points out that we've heard mainly about products and consumables that could be made in a more carbon efficient manner, but how do entrepreneurs help to address the sort of more holistic, as David said, the systemic issues that might fit in with both a healthier environment for people and climatically sound, and I would say nature positive, and all of these other things that we're seeking. How can we design cities and transportation systems that are carbon efficient, but also, you know, maintain a good, rich environment for us all to live in? And so this question, I think, gets to the heart of how do entrepreneurs contribute to system change? Does anyone want to tackle that?
Well, I can certainly chip in on the, you know, system change in the context of communities. So, I mean, we do definitely see that. I think I just take Cambridge. I mean, there's been a lot of developments, but in part because Cambridge has become so much more of a busy city than it used to be. But clearly, there's been a lot of effort to think through how do you have a more sustainable city. I think you can see a lot of it in the Nordics as well. If you look at things like recycling rates in Austria and Switzerland and Germany, it's, I think, 98% of you know, plastic bottles and so on. So I think a lot of this kind of system change for the community level really has to come from people voting for parties who represent values which moving the community towards system change. And look, it's even in the US, I think there are a lot of great examples in Colorado, for instance. There's a lot of good things happening there. So ultimately, it's that question. If you look in Germany, I think the Green Party maybe came fourth or something in the last federal elections. So from my point of view, you want to see that community level shift, then it's really about voting.
Yeah, so business and entrepreneurship can't solve it alone. On that note, so David, I think you wanted to speak to this question too, is what do you see as the biggest challenge to entrepreneurship in relation to climate change? I mean, we need frameworks that actually obviously compel action from governments and from elsewhere, but what else do you see as big challenges remaining?
Well, sadly, I think it's the obverse of what I just said, which is the entrepreneurs can find it very hard to look behind the vacuous pledges of politicians. You know, a pledge not really having any legally binding requirement behind it, and then assuming that because all these pledges are out there, and you know, we've seen the same thing from large companies as well, who quietly retire their sustainability goals because they found it too inconvenient to deliver on them. And if you're an entrepreneur who's hoovering up all this good news and you know, you're a kind of optimistic character, and then actually you spend a year, 2 years developing a proposition, only to find out that people have decided that the market's gone down and they can't afford to do that, or you know, there's been a pandemic and so the government's got to put its money somewhere else. So I think that is still a huge challenge for entrepreneurs to really understand how real is the demand and how much longevity is there going to be behind it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's always something else that might come along. I think we're building momentum, but we're certainly not there yet. It's clear. But I don't want to end on that note. I want to end ideally on what gives you hope. So, you know, climate change is huge. And then you add in all of these other aspects of the challenges that we face as a society. You add in the need for system level change. You can't go it alone. But what gives you hope about our collective ability to tackle climate change? We'll just go 30 seconds per person. Can I start with you, Andy?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the reason I have hope is that I think that most people get it now. I mean, we've got some political, you know, large governments, giant corporate interest holdouts. But I think, you know, I'm beginning to see that action is beginning to happen everywhere, and in many cases, I mean, you know, I cite obviously ampersand as my example, but it's happening not just in the first world, but it's happening across the globe, and third world countries are going to be leapfrogging directly to sustainability, I think, and I find that inspiring.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic.
That's fantastic, and let's admit it, many of the developing world will bear the brunt. So there's reason to be optimistic that things are happening everywhere. James, you're next.
I would actually just echo Andy. People understand the need for change and they're ready for change. And when the collective moves, it can move very quickly. And that, yeah, that makes you happy.
That's great. Catriona.
Similar, but particularly with regards to the young people, yeah, the enthusiasm and determination that I see. I do quite a bit of going to schools and talk about what you can do with an engineering degree, and the kids just know so much. I'm always amazed, and they all know about climate change, and they all know. And I think, you know, even just a bit of peer pressure from kids to parents can go a long way, and that's yeah, what the young people are going to demand for. That gives me hope.
Yeah, and it's their future, so they should. David.
Yes, well, I think one of the things that we've seen is suddenly people generally feel climate change is happening now. And really, even 3 years ago, that wasn't the case with, you know, the terrible fires in Australia, 1 billion mammals killed, you know, the smoke from the west coast of the US drifting over into New York City. So I think it's the recent floods in Europe. So I do feel that there's more of a collective belief that it's not a problem that's going to arrive in 2050. It's happening to all of us now. And that's really triggered a much stronger response in terms of more immediate action. And I know Trinity Hall has a connection with Charles Darwin, and I think he said it's not the most intellectual or the strongest or the fastest species that survives, but the one that's most able to adapt. So hopefully we can rely on Charles Darwin, I should say, again.
Yeah, thank you, David. Collective need for adaptation and survival. Fantastic. Thank you all. It's been really wonderful spending the time with you. We're at the top of the hour. I want to hand it over briefly to Shell to wrap us up, but I've so appreciated our conversation. Thank you all.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to you, Jen, for chairing so brilliantly, and to all our panelists. We obviously wish you and all our entrepreneurs tackling climate change every success. We do have an entrepreneurs group both on LinkedIn and on our online community link hall. So please do register there and connect and network with each other. And we have a couple more events coming up in our climate change series. One on the 9th of November, another panel discussion. This time, can we provide courageous business leadership in the face of climate change? And then we have another of our fellows talking about his research on the 10th of November. This is Professor Adam Branch talking about climate change and non-fossil fuels, charcoal deforestation and urbanization in East Africa. So I hope you'll join us for those. We've got full details on our website, and the recordings of all of these events will be put on the Trinity Hall YouTube channel. So I just say a final thank you to Jen, to Andy, to Catriona, to David, and to James, and thank you to all of you at home for watching. Hopefully see you back in college again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. This evening.